People will forgive you for the thing you did to them far sooner than you will forgive yourself for the thing they did for you in silence. I found this out in a safe deposit box at a Umpqua Bank branch on McLaughlin Boulevard, 11 months after my mother-in-law's funeral, holding a wire transfer receipt for $38,400, dated September the 9th, 2016. I told Eleanor Ellison she was a burden on my family. She looked at me in the doorway of the guest room I had converted back into an office within the month, and she said, "I know. I am." She did not fight it. She did not cry. She agreed with me completely, and I let that agreement be the end of the conversation, when it should have been the beginning of every question I never thought to ask. My name is Dana Reyes. I'm 34 years old. I live in the Alberta Arts District in Portland, Oregon, and for the last 11 years I have worked in wealth management, most recently as a senior vice president at a firm called Callahan Voss on Southwest 5th. I say that fast and flat because it's easier that way. Degree, job, title, done. And because for a long time I believed those three facts were the whole of who I was, the proof that I'd built something real. I need you to understand that I am not telling you this story so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling it because I spent 8 years being the villain of it, and not knowing. And I think there might be someone watching this who is doing the same thing right now, tonight in some version of my old kitchen, and doesn't know it yet either. So let me back up. You need to understand how it started, because none of what I did makes sense without the woman I did it to. Eleanor Ellison was 61 years old when I married her son. She'd been a seamstress for 34 of those years, first at a dry cleaner's on Southeast Foster that did alterations on the side, and later out of the converted garage behind her house in Milwaukee, a low-slung brick ranch on a street called Roswell that her husband Walt had bought in 1979 for $18,000 and paid off in full before he died of a stroke in the driveway in 2009. Wrench still in his hand, working on the same 74 F100 he'd owned since he was 19. Eleanor kept the truck. She kept the garage exactly the way he left it, tools hung on a pegboard he'd outlined in Sharpie so you'd know if anything was missing, and she kept sewing in the corner of it, next to his workbench, like she wanted the sound of her machine to keep him company. She had a routine I could set a clock to. Up at 5:30, coffee made by 5:40, and every morning, rain or frost or the one time it actually snowed in Milwaukee, she'd set a thermos of coffee on the porch railing at 6 for the mail carrier, a woman named Deb who'd had the route 11 years and whose husband was on disability. Because Eleanor had decided at some point that Deb looked cold in October and never stopped deciding it. She never asked Deb if she wanted it, she just did it, every day, and if you asked her why she'd say, "I don't mind." Which I came to understand was Eleanor's answer to almost everything, and which I mistook, for years, for a woman who simply didn't have strong feelings about her own life. She kept a jar of buttons on the windowsill above her machine, sorted by nothing I could ever figure out, not color, not size, just Eleanor's own private logic, decades of them, some clearly off coats that had been given away or thrown out long before I met her. She mended things without being asked. A hem on my work slacks I hadn't mentioned was coming loose. A button on Mark's peacoat. She'd just hand them back to you, finished, and say, "It was nothing," and you'd stop noticing after a while, the way you stop noticing a furnace that's working properly. She had regulars, too, from her alteration days, women she'd sewn for decades earlier, who still called her for wedding dresses and christening gowns even after she'd technically retired, and she never charged them what the work was worth. I asked her about it once, early on, why she still did the big jobs. A full wedding gown taken in could take her 30 hours for $80 when a shop in the Pearl District would charge $400. She said, "They're not paying for my time, honey. They're paying for me to say yes." And I remember thinking that was a strange way to run a business, and not understanding for years that Eleanor had never once been running a business. She'd been running something else entirely, a quiet ledger of who needed what and who could give it. And money was only ever the smallest part of how she kept that ledger balanced. Money in that family had a shape, and the shape was this. Eleanor had it. Modestly, in the quiet way of someone who paid off a house and never took a vacation she couldn't afford in cash. Mark, her son and my husband, did not have it, not because he was reckless, but because he was a high school shop teacher and a part-time contractor, a good one, and neither of those pays what people think it does. And I had it, or I was building it fast, and I liked how that felt more than I want to admit to you now. Mark's older sister, Kayla, lived in Bend and had 2 kids and a husband who ran a snowboard shop that lost money 4 years out of 5, and Eleanor helped them, quietly, the way she helped everyone quietly, a car repair here, a few $100s there. Never mentioned, never repaid, never expected to be. I used to think Eleanor had favorites. I understand now she just had a habit of giving to whoever was closest to falling, and for a long time that wasn't me. Until it was. There's a third thing I need to tell you about, alongside the thermos and the button jar, because it matters later, more than either of the other two. Eleanor kept a small green metal recipe box on top of the refrigerator, and inside it, behind the index cards for her pot roast and her rhubarb crisp, there was an envelope of cash she called, when she called it anything at all, the just-in-case money. I only knew about it because Mark told me, early in our marriage, half laughing, the way you tell a story about a parent's quirk. His mother had kept an emergency envelope like that since before he was born, refilled it whenever she could, and he'd watched her hand bills out of it his whole childhood. For a neighbor's furnace, for a cousin's bus ticket, for his own senior class trip when Walt had said no and Eleanor had quietly said yes. It was never a large amount. A few $100s, sometimes closer to 1,000 around the holidays. I want you to hold on to that green box, because I didn't think about it again for 8 years, and it turned out to matter more than anything else in that house. I remember the first Thanksgiving I spent with the Ellisons, 2 years before Mark and I married, sitting at Eleanor's table while she cut a nick out of the turkey skin near the wishbone and told me, without being asked, that Walt used to say she'd give away the house if you let her stand on the porch long enough. She said it fondly. She said most things about Walt fondly, even the ones that weren't compliments, and I remember thinking, at the time, that I'd never met anyone so at peace with being taken advantage of. I called it that in my head, taken advantage of, and I want you to notice that word, because it tells you exactly where my head was before I'd done a single wrong thing to her. I had already decided, before I ever hurt Eleanor Ellison, that her generosity was a flaw to be managed rather than a strength to be trusted, and that decision made everything that came later so much easier than it should have been. When Mark and I got married, in June of 2014, at a small venue out past Sandy with string lights and a rented arch, Eleanor paid for the flowers without either of us asking her to, quietly handing the florist a check the week of, and when my own mother made a comment at the reception. Not unkindly, just carelessly. Something about how nice it was that someone had stepped up on the budget. I remember laughing along with the table instead of saying thank you to the woman sitting 3 seats down who'd actually done it. Eleanor didn't say anything either. She just refilled Walt's old seat's water glass out of habit, an empty chair we'd left at her request, and went on eating her dinner like the comment hadn't landed anywhere near her. I noticed that she noticed. I didn't do anything about it. That was already the pattern, 2 years before I ever called her a burden, Eleanor giving quietly, the room absorbing it without comment, and me standing close enough to see it happen, and choosing not to say the one sentence that would have cost me nothing. Here's the thing I need to say, plainly, because the whole shape of this story depends on you understanding it wasn't complicated or cinematic. In September of 2016, I stole $38,400 from a client. His name was Elmer Halvorsen. He was 83, a retired millwright from Estacada, and he'd had a trust account with our firm since before I started, managed jointly by me and a senior partner named Rick Osai, who trusted me with more discretion than my 2 years at the firm should have earned me. I was up for a promotion to VP that October, and the promotion hinged on a number: assets under management, growth against target, a figure that sat on a spreadsheet Rick reviewed every Friday. And I was $400,000 short of the number I'd told him I'd hit. I had also, separately and stupidly, put $60,000 of my own money into a margin position on a biotech stock a college friend swore was about to get EFTA approval, and it hadn't gotten approval, and I had 11 days to cover a margin call before my brokerage force liquidated the account and turned a paper loss into a real, permanent $41,000 hole in my life. I moved the money on a Thursday. I had signing authority on the Halvorsen Trust for routine disbursements. Quarterly required minimum distributions, the kind of thing that goes out automatically and nobody double-checks for weeks. I initiated a transfer that looked, on the surface, like an early distribution request, moved it into a holding account, and from there, into my own brokerage to cover the call. My plan, and I want you to hear how thin this plan actually was to replace the money before the quarterly reconciliation in October, using a bonus I was expecting from a separate book of business, and nobody would ever know a thing had moved. I told myself it wasn't stealing because I intended to give it back. I want to be honest with you, that is exactly what stealing is. Intending to give it back is not a defense. It's just the story thieves tell themselves at 2 a.m. I'd met Elmer Halvorsen exactly twice, both times in a conference room on the 11th floor with his daughter present, a soft-spoken man who kept his reading glasses on a chain and thanked the receptionist by name on the way out both visits. He'd built the account over 4 decades at a mill outside Estacada, retired at 60, and told me, the second time we met, that the money wasn't really his anymore in his head. It was his daughter's and his grandkids now. He was just the one holding it steady until it was time to hand it over. I remember writing that down in my notes as a client priority, a phrase you use in wealth management the way you'd use a tag on a file, and I remember not feeling anything in particular when I wrote it, which tells you something about where I already was before September ever came. There's a version of that week I still think about, where I go to my own savings instead, where I call my mother and ask to borrow the difference, where I take the loss on the biotech stock and eat $41,000 of humiliation instead of committing a felony. I had those options. I want to be clear that I had those options and considered them for maybe an hour at my desk on a Wednesday before I decided the shame of admitting the mistake out loud was a bigger threat to the life I wanted than moving a dead man's, a stranger's, an old man's, retirement money for 6 weeks. I chose the version of myself that could still walk into Rick's office and be congratulated. I wasn't entirely alone in that office, either, in the sense that other people saw pieces of what was happening and chose not to look closer, which is its own kind of complicity even if nobody handed me the transfer form themselves. A colleague of mine, a junior advisor named Priya Anand, who sat 2 desks over, noticed I was pulling my personal brokerage statements up on my monitor more than usual that September, and asked me once, lightly over coffee in the break room, whether everything was okay with my portfolio. I laughed it off, said something about a rough patch in biotech. Everyone was having a rough patch in biotech that year. She let it go, the way you let things go with a colleague you like and don't want to embarrass. I don't blame Priya for any of what I did. But I've thought about that break room more than once since, about how easy it is to hand someone a graceful exit from a question they didn't really want asked, and how many small, ordinary kindnesses like that one I used, without ever noticing, to keep myself from having to tell the truth to anyone at all. Eleanor was staying with us that whole month. She'd had a hip replacement in late August, and Mark and I had the space, so she took our guest room for what was supposed to be 3 weeks of recovery. I remember the exact date I moved the money because it was 6 days after her surgery. And I remember it because I made the transfer from my laptop at our kitchen table at 11 at night. And I remember, though I didn't think anything of it then, that Eleanor's bedroom door, right off the kitchen, was open a few inches, the way it always was, so she could hear the dog. There was one moment, a real and specific moment, where I could have stopped. Rick called me into his office on a Tuesday, September the 13th, because the transfer had tripped a flag in the compliance system. A routine flag for any distribution outside the normal RMD schedule, and he asked me, not suspiciously, just as a formality, to walk him through it. I stood in his office on the 11th floor with a view of the Willamette, and I lied to a man who had mentored me for 2 years, and I watched him nod and clear the flag himself, and I felt something in my chest that I now recognize as the exact moment I became someone I would spend the next 8 years trying not to look at directly. He gave me an off-ramp without even knowing he was doing it. He trusted me enough not to look closer. I could have told him the truth right then, eaten the consequences, and been done with it in a week. I chose the lie because the lie was easier, and because some part of me had already decided that being caught was a worse outcome than being someone who deserved to be caught. He asked me one direct question that day, sitting behind his desk with the flag report open on his monitor, angled slightly toward me the way he always did, when he wanted you to feel included rather than interrogated. He said, "Anything I need to worry about here, Dana?" And I said, "No. Just cleaning up some paperwork on an early distribution request. Elmer's daughter wanted a head start on some estate planning." It took 4 seconds to say. I'd rehearsed it in the elevator on the way up. Rick nodded, said something about how thorough I was getting to be, and cleared the flag with 2 clicks while I stood there watching a career I hadn't earned yet get handed to me on the strength of a lie he had no reason to doubt. I said thank you on my way out. I actually thanked him. I didn't sleep that week. Eleanor noticed. Of course she noticed. She was recovering from surgery in the next room, and she had raised 2 kids and buried a husband, and there wasn't much about a frightened person's silence she hadn't seen before. On the night of September the 15th, I was on the back porch on the phone with Rick's assistant, trying to figure out when exactly the October reconciliation would run, phrasing my questions like I was just being thorough, and I didn't hear the screen door until Eleanor was already standing there in her robe, 4 days post-op, holding on to the railing. She didn't ask me anything. She just stood there a moment, looking at me the way you'd look at a kettle that had been on too long, and then she said, "You should come inside. It's cold," and went back in. That was all. I've replayed that 60-second exchange more times than any other minute of my adult life, because I know now, I didn't know then, that she had heard enough of that phone call to understand exactly what kind of trouble I was in, and she never said a word to me about it. Not that night. Not ever. What I did, instead, in the days after, was turn my fear into something I could point at her. I don't know a gentler way to say that. I was drowning in a secret I'd created myself, and Eleanor, healing in our guest room, needing help getting to the bathroom at 3 in the morning, needing her dressing changed, needing someone to sit with her when the pain medication made her anxious, Eleanor became, in my head, the reason my life had gotten hard. It wasn't logical. I want to be clear that I knew, somewhere underneath, that it wasn't logical. But logic wasn't running things that month. On September the 22nd, 13 days after I moved the money, I told my husband's mother, recovering from a hip replacement in my house, that she was a burden. It started over something small, the way these things always do, she'd asked me, gently, twice. Whether I could pick up her prescription on my way home instead of Mark doing it after his shop class, because Mark had a parent conference that ran late, and I remember standing in the kitchen doorway with my laptop bag still on my shoulder, 3 days from a reconciliation I was terrified of, and something in me just broke open sideways at her. I don't remember every word I used, and I'm not going to dress it up as more articulate or more cruel than it was. It was something closer to, I can't do this right now. Eleanor, I have enough going on, and you being here is one more thing I have to manage. I can't be your pharmacy and your ride and your nurse and still do my job. You're a lot right now. You're a burden right now, and I don't have anything left over for it. She was sitting up in bed with her physical therapy sheet on her lap, and she looked at me for a second, not shocked, not wounded, just still, the way she got still before she said anything that mattered. And she said, I know. I am. And she looked back down at the sheet and kept doing her exercises, counting under her breath, like I hadn't said anything that mattered at all. She didn't ask me to leave the room. She didn't ask me to take back a word of it. She finished her set of 10 leg lifts, put the sheet aside, and said, I'll call about a ride myself. You go on and get some sleep. You look tired. And that was the last thing either of us said that night. I told myself at the time that her calm was proof I was right. If I'd been out of line, she would have argued. My own mother would have argued. Eleanor's agreement felt to me like confirmation, like she'd been waiting for someone to finally say the true thing out loud. I didn't understand, not for 8 more years, that a woman who was actively, secretly protecting me from the consequences of a federal crime did not have the luxury of a fight with me over hurt feelings. Every ounce of friction between us was a risk to a secret she'd decided to carry alone. Agreeing with me cost her nothing that mattered to her, and cost me a version of myself I still haven't fully forgiven. She moved out on October the 3rd, 3 days ahead of her doctor's recommended timeline, into a small 1-bedroom apartment in a senior complex off Highway 224 that Mark found for her in 4 days flat, apologizing to her the whole time in a way he never apologized to me. I helped pack 1 box that morning, her sewing supplies, and I remember she thanked me for it, genuinely. No edge in her voice at all, and handed me back a pair of my own slacks she'd hemmed the week before. Finished, folded, done. As if the last thing she wanted to leave behind in that house was one more piece of evidence that she'd been useful in it. I took the slacks. I said thank you. I did not ask her to stay another day, even though her own doctor had recommended 3 more weeks. And I watched Mark carry her suitcase to the car with his jaw tight the whole time, a version of anger I mistook, at the time, for simple exhaustion from moving furniture. I told myself I'd handled a hard situation reasonably. I told myself a lot of things that October. The reconciliation ran on October the 12th. I don't know, to this day, exactly what happened in the 72 hours before it, because I wasn't watching the Halvorsen account. I was too afraid to look at it, the way you're afraid to look at a text message you know is bad news. What I know is that on October the 12th, the account balanced. The money was there. My bonus hadn't come through yet, it didn't land until November, so on paper, a debt I owed did not exist for a window of 5 weeks. And then it simply didn't exist at all, and I told myself the crisis had passed because I'd been careful, when in fact the crisis had passed because someone else had quietly, invisibly stepped into a hole I'd dug and filled it in with her own hands while I stood there congratulating myself on my composure. I got the promotion in November. VP at 24 years old, the youngest in the firm's Portland office. There was a dinner. Rick gave a toast about my discipline under pressure. I remember smiling and thinking, with real relief, that I had gotten away with something, and I remember, underneath that relief, a small, persistent unease I never let myself name. Because naming it would have meant admitting what I'd done, and admitting what I'd done would have meant admitting I owed someone $38,400, and I had no idea who. The years that followed have a shape I can describe to you in time-lapse, because that's honestly how they felt while I was living them. For the first year, Eleanor and I saw each other at holidays and not much else, and I told myself that was normal, that daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law weren't supposed to be close, that some distance was healthy. Mark visited her on his own most Sundays, brought her groceries, fixed things in her apartment that the complex was slow to fix, and I didn't go along most weeks. And neither of us made a thing of it out loud. By the second year, I'd been promoted again to head of a small advisory team, and I told people at work, when it came up, that I'd learned early to keep family and career in separate rooms, and I said it like it was wisdom instead of what it actually was, which was distance dressed up as discipline. Around year 3, Eleanor had a fall in her kitchen. Nothing broken. A bruised hip. A scare. And Mark called me from the hospital waiting room at 11 at night, and I remember I didn't drive down. I told him I had an early call with a client in New York, and I'd see them both for dinner that weekend, and I remember the particular quality of the silence on his end of the phone. A silence I chose not to interpret at the time, because interpreting it would have required me to feel something I'd gotten very good at not feeling. That same year, I made managing director of my division, the youngest in the firm's history, and Callahan Voss ran a small feature about me in their internal newsletter with a photo of me at my desk, arms crossed. The Willamette out the window behind me. Eleanor never saw it. I never sent it to her. Not out of malice, just because it didn't occur to me that she'd want to, but Mark printed it out and kept it folded in his wallet for a while, which I only found out about years later, going through his things during the 6 weeks he was in Bend, a small paper reminder of a wife he'd been proud of once. Before he understood what that career had cost the person who never got a newsletter feature of her own. For 3 winters in a row, I didn't call her on her birthday, which was January the 8th. Mark always did, and always put me on the phone for 2 or 3 minutes near the end, and I'd say something warm and generic, and Eleanor would say, "That's all right, honey. I know you're busy," in a tone I read, every single time, as genuine reassurance, and which I understand now was something closer to a woman being careful not to ask for more than I was willing to give her, because she'd already decided, apparently, that I didn't owe her anything at all. There is a missed call from her, in May of the 5th year, that I still have a screenshot of on an old phone in a drawer. Because something in me, even then, couldn't quite delete it. I didn't call her back that day. I called her back 4 days later, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting, and we talked for 11 minutes about nothing. Deb the mail carrier's granddaughter's graduation, a recipe, the truck's transmission, and at no point did she mention why she'd called in the first place. And at no point did I ask, and I've wondered since whether that was the day she needed something from me and decided, watching 4 days go by in silence, that she'd been right about herself back in that guest room after all. I want to describe one more scene from that stretch of years because it's the one that still catches in my throat more than any of the others. Mark and I hosted Christmas at our house in the 6th year, the whole family, and Eleanor arrived carrying a covered dish and a small wrapped box for each of us, the way she always did, and at some point in the evening I found her in my kitchen, alone, running a thumb along a hairline crack in one of my ceramic mixing bowls, an old one I'd inherited from my own grandmother. She didn't say anything about fixing it, she just noted it, quietly, the way she noted everything, and 2 weeks later a box arrived in the mail with the bowl inside, the crack sealed invisibly with some kind of food-safe epoxy she must have researched and ordered herself. No note, no mention of it at the next holiday, nothing. I used that bowl for years without once asking her how she'd known it needed fixing, or thanking her properly. Because by then I had trained myself not to look too closely at the small, constant ways she was still taking care of a house she'd been told, in that same kitchen that she was too much trouble to be near. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, in year 4, Kayla's husband's snowboard shop nearly went under, and Eleanor covered 2 months of their lease out of savings I now know were already thinner than any of us realized, and I remember feeling a flare of something ugly and unspoken when Mark mentioned it to me, not concern for Kayla, not concern for Eleanor, but a kind of petty accounting. A sense that Eleanor did more for Kayla's family than she'd ever done for us, when the truth, the actual truth, was that Eleanor had already done more for me than for anyone else in that family. I simply didn't know it yet. I said something to Mark at the time about how Kayla needed to learn to stand on her own, and Mark, to his credit, didn't argue, just went quiet, in a way I now recognize as him choosing not to fight a battle he could tell I wasn't ready to lose. I heard about her cancer diagnosis secondhand, from Kayla, at a family barbecue in the 7th summer, 4 months after Eleanor had already started treatment. Mark had known the whole time and hadn't told me, which should have told me something about the state of our marriage that I was still too busy to look at directly. Eleanor had asked him not to make a fuss. Stage 2, caught reasonably early, a surgery and 6 rounds of chemo she did almost entirely on her own, driving herself to the infusion center off McLaughlin because she didn't want to be, in her word, a hassle to anyone. I offered when I found out to help with the medical bills. She said, and I remember this exactly because it was the last real conversation of substance we ever had, "I've got it handled, Dana. I always do." I took that as pride. I know now it was closer to a woman guarding a secret that had already cost her almost everything she had left, and could not afford one more person looking too closely at where her money had gone 8 years earlier. There was a night in the 8th year, maybe 4 months before she died, when I sat in my car outside her apartment complex off Highway 24 for 11 minutes with the engine running, having driven there on some impulse I couldn't fully name. Meaning to knock on her door and just sit with her for a while, no occasion, the way Mark always had. I watched her light go on in the kitchen window, watched a shape that was unmistakably her cross past it once, twice, and I didn't get out of the car. I told myself it was late, that I didn't want to intrude, that I'd call instead and set something up properly for the weekend. I drove home. I never called about that weekend. I think about those 11 minutes more than almost anything else in this story, because it was the last real chance I had to close the distance while she was still well enough for it to have been an easy, ordinary visit instead of the complicated, freighted thing it became after. She died in March of 2024, in a hospice bed in the same complex off Highway 224, with Mark and Kayla in the room and me arriving 40 minutes after. Because I was in a meeting when the call came, and I finished the meeting before I checked my phone. I am not going to soften that for you. I finished the meeting. The funeral was small, the senior center director, Deb the mail carrier, a handful of women from a quilting circle Eleanor had joined in her last 2 years that I hadn't even known existed. I stood at the front in a black dress that cost more than the casket, and I gave a short, generic eulogy about a wonderful mother-in-law, and I believed every generic word of it. And I still had no idea what I was actually standing there having failed to understand. Mark and Kayla asked me to help settle the estate. Mostly because of my job, I understood accounts, probate, the paperwork. And in June, 11 months after the funeral, the three of us drove out to the Umpqua branch on McLaughlin to open the safe deposit box listed in her will. Inside, there wasn't much. A stack of photographs, Walt's watch, the deed to the Roswell Street house, a savings bond from 1998, and a manila envelope, unlabeled, that Kayla handed to me because I was the one with the accounting background and it looked like it might be financial. I opened it at the little table by the vault, and the first thing that fell out was a Umpqua Bank wire transfer receipt, dated September the 9th, 2016, in the amount of $38,400, made out to an account with a routing number I recognized instantly and completely, because I had spent 8 years pretending I would never see that number again. It was a receipt for a transfer into the Halvorson Family Trust. Underneath it was a second receipt from an equipment auction house in Gresham for the sale of a set of woodworking tools, Walt's tools, off the pegboard he'd outlined in Sharpie, the ones I'd assumed Eleanor kept forever out of sentiment, sold on September the 7th, 2 days before the wire, for $19,200. And underneath that, a pension account statement showing an early lump sum withdrawal of $22,000, processed the same week, with an early withdrawal penalty clearly itemized, a penalty a woman with Eleanor's careful habits would never have paid unless something had made the money need to move faster than the rules allowed for. Mark asked what it was. I couldn't answer him for what felt like a very long time. He asked again, softer, thinking maybe I hadn't heard him. "Dana, what is that? What's the routing thing?" And I remember setting the receipts down flat on the little table, lining them up edge to edge like I could make them mean something less by making them neat, and saying, "It's mine. It's from my old job. Give me a minute." Kayla was still going through the photographs at the other end of the table and hadn't noticed, laughing softly at a picture of Eleanor and Walt at the coast sometime in the 80s, and I sat there with a woman's entire quiet, deliberate liquidation of everything she had left, her husband's tools, her retirement, her own comfort, laid out on a bank table in 3 separate receipts. And I understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly what she had done, and exactly when she had done it, and exactly why, and I understood that she had done it while I was telling her, in the next room of my own house, that she was a burden. There was one more piece of paper in the envelope. A letter, in Eleanor's handwriting, folded twice, never mailed, no envelope of its own, addressed simply, "Dear Dana." I have not shown this letter to anyone but Mark. I'm not going to read it to you word for word, because some things are hers and stay hers, but I can tell you what it said, because I have it memorized the way you memorize the last thing someone ever says to you when you weren't in the room to hear it live. She wrote that she'd heard enough of my phone call that September to understand I was in real trouble, the kind of trouble that could end a career or worse. She wrote that she'd thought about it for 2 days before she did anything, because she wanted to be sure it wasn't her business to tell me to fix it myself. She wrote that she decided, in the end, that watching me lose everything I'd built wasn't going to fix anything for anyone, including that poor man whose money I'd taken, and that the fastest way to make him whole was the only thing that mattered, not whether I deserved to be the one who fixed it. She wrote that Walt would have understood about the tools, that a man who spent 30 years building things with his hands would rather they go toward keeping his family out of a courtroom than sit gathering dust in a garage nobody used anymore. And she wrote, near the end, that when I told her she was a burden, 13 days after she'd wired away almost everything she had to protect me. It hadn't even hurt the way I probably imagined it did, because by then she'd already decided what she was there for, and being called something I clearly needed to say out loud didn't cost her much compared to that. She wrote, I don't mind, Dana. I never did. I hope one day you understand that wasn't the same thing as not minding what you'd done. I sat in that bank with the letter in my hands for what Mark later told me was almost 10 minutes, and I didn't cry, not there, and I think that surprised him more than anything else that day. He asked me, quietly, so Kayla wouldn't hear, what does it say, Dana? And I couldn't get the words out in order, so I just handed it to him and watched his face while he read it. Watched the exact moment he reached the part about the tools, and watched something in his jaw set that I recognized, because I'd seen it on Eleanor's face plenty of times without understanding what it meant. The look of someone deciding in real time how much of what they were feeling they were going to let show in a public place. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. Kayla rode with us, still going through photographs in the back seat, oblivious to the 2 pieces of paper sitting in my lap that had just rearranged 8 years of her family's history, and I remember staring out the passenger window at the exit for Milwaukee, going by and thinking, with a kind of vertigo I'd never felt before, that I had spent nearly a decade constructing an entire story about who Eleanor Ellison was, passive, self-effacing, a little pitiable, easy to set aside, and that story had been wrong in every particular that mattered, built entirely out of what was convenient for me to believe, rather than what was true. The weeks after the bank found me revisiting things I hadn't let myself think about in years. I thought about the thermos on the porch rail. I found out from Deb at the funeral that Eleanor had kept that ritual going even in the 2 years she was doing chemo, some mornings barely able to stand, because she'd decided a long time ago that Deb needed it more than she needed to be excused from it. I thought about the button jar, which I still have, sitting on a shelf in my own house now, and about a coat of mine she'd mended without a word in the fall of 2016, the same month I now realize that she was quietly selling her husband's tools to cover a felony I'd committed, mending my coat anyway, because apparently there was room in her for both. I told Mark everything. Not in one sitting, I couldn't manage that, but over about 3 weeks, in pieces. Starting with the money in 2016, and ending with what I'd said to his mother in that guest room. I want to be honest about how that went, because this isn't a story about a marriage healing cleanly either. He was angry in a way I'd never seen from him, not loud, just very still, and there was one night about 10 days in when he finally said the thing he'd clearly been sitting on. He asked me, "Did you ever, even once, think about what it would do to her telling her that while she was already carrying this for you?" And I said, honestly, because it was the only honest answer I had, I didn't know she was carrying anything. That's the whole problem, Mark. I didn't know, and I didn't ask. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's not an answer. That's just a fact about you." And he was right, and I didn't have anything to say back to that. He told me he needed time before he could be in the same room with me without thinking about his mother selling his father's tools to protect me from a crime she found out about by accident through a door I hadn't bothered to close. He moved into his brother-in-law's guest room in Bend for 6 weeks that summer. We are back together now, but I won't tell you it was simple. Because it wasn't, and I think if I told you it was simple, you'd be right not to trust the rest of what I've told you. I confronted what Eleanor had actually said to me in that bedroom, too, turning it over the way you turn over a photograph you thought you understood and suddenly don't. I know. I am. I had heard those 4 words for 8 years as surrender. I understand them now as something closer to mercy, a woman who had already decided that whatever I needed to say to make myself feel less afraid, she could absorb it, because she had already paid the actual cost of my fear in a currency I never even knew was being spent. I went out to the Roswell Street house. Kayla and Mark hadn't sold it yet, and I stood in that garage in front of the empty pegboard, the Sharpie outlines still visible where Walt's tools used to hang, every single one of them gone since September of 2016. And I said, out loud, to no one, I'm sorry, and it felt both true and completely insufficient at the same time, which I think is probably how it's supposed to feel. I found the green recipe box, too, in a cabinet at the Roswell Street house, still on top of where the old refrigerator used to sit before Kayla replaced it, and I finally understood what I was looking at when I opened it. Behind the recipe cards, there was no cash left, none at all. The just-in-case envelope was empty, folded flat, the way you'd fold something you didn't expect to need again. I sat on Eleanor's kitchen floor with that empty envelope in my hands for a long time, doing the arithmetic I should have done years earlier. A woman who kept an emergency fund replenished for 4 decades had let it run dry sometime in 2016 and never refilled it. Not once, in the 8 years she had left. I don't know exactly which piece of the $38,400 came out of that envelope. I know some of it did, because Mark remembered, once I asked him directly, that she'd stopped keeping cash in the house sometime around then, told him vaguely that banks were safer these days, a small, practical-sounding lie that had covered an enormous truth for 8 years. I went, alone, to Elmer Halvorson's grave. He died in 2019, at 86, in his sleep, never knowing his account had ever moved a dollar it shouldn't have. I stood there, and I told a stone the truth I'd never told a living person, and I don't know what I expected that to fix, and it didn't fix anything. But I did it anyway, because Eleanor had spent everything she had making sure that man never had to know what I'd done to him, and it felt like the least I owed either of them was to say it somewhere, finally, out loud. I did not go to my compliance department. I want to be honest about that too, because I think a cleaner version of this story would have me confessing to Rick, facing my license, facing whatever consequence was still legally available 8 years later. I didn't do that. The statute of limitations on what I did had run out years before I ever opened that envelope, and I told myself that meant the debt was closed. I don't fully believe that anymore, but I also haven't undone that choice, and I'm not going to pretend to you that I have, because this isn't a story where I get to be clean. What I did instead was quieter and slower, and it started with the tools. I found the auction house in Gresham, tracked down who'd bought Walt's set, a retired contractor in Sandy who'd kept the whole lot together, still in working order, still recognizable, and I asked if I could buy it back. He didn't want to sell at first. It took 4 visits, and eventually more money than the tools were worth, before he agreed, mostly, I think, because I told him the truth about whose they'd been and why they'd been sold. I gave the set to Mark on what would have been Eleanor's 70th birthday. He didn't say much. He put his hand flat on the workbench they used to sit beside and left it there a long time. And that was enough of an answer. I set up a fund at the community college in Gresham, where Eleanor had taken a free tailoring refresher class in her 60s, just for the joy of it, long before any of this, a scholarship in her name for women returning to vocational trades later in life, seeded with $38,400 of my own money, the exact figure, on purpose. Because I wanted there to be at least one place where that number meant something being built instead of something being hidden. I don't publicize it. It isn't for anyone but her and the 2 women, so far, who've used it. Kayla and I are closer than we used to be, mostly because grief made room for a version of honesty neither of us had bothered with before. I told her, eventually, most of what I've told you here, sitting in her kitchen in Bend with her kids asleep upstairs, and I braced myself for her anger, because I'd earned it, and I knew it. What she actually said, after a long quiet, was, "I always thought she loved you a little more carefully than the rest of us." I used to be jealous of that, honestly. Now I think I understand why. She didn't forgive me outright. That night or since, she told me plainly that trust with her would take longer than an apology. That she needed to see who I was over years, not in a single conversation. And I've tried to accept that as fair, instead of arguing for something faster and easier. I started a modest, unglamorous habit after that, driving to Bend once a month, no occasion, just to help with the kids or sit at her table, the kind of ordinary, repeated presence Eleanor used to offer everyone but me. Kayla lets me help now. She still keeps a little distance around it, and I've stopped expecting her not to. Mark and I are rebuilding something that resembles our marriage, slower than either of us would like with a therapist, with a lot of silences that used to scare me and don't as much anymore. He told me in one of our sessions that what he needed from me wasn't a bigger apology, it was smaller, more boring proof. Showing up on ordinary Tuesdays, answering the phone on the first ring instead of the fourth, the unglamorous currency his mother had spent her whole life paying out to people who rarely noticed. I'm trying to learn that currency. I'm not naturally good at it yet. We kept the house on Roswell Street. I sew now, badly, at Eleanor's machine in the garage, next to Walt's returned tools. And I keep a thermos on the porch rail some mornings, not every morning, because I'm not her and I never will be, but often enough that Deb, who still has the root, knows to knock now instead of just walking past. The first time I did it, Deb stood on the porch a moment with the thermos in her hand and said, "She used to do this." I wondered if anybody would keep it up. I told her I was trying. She said that was more than most people manage, and drove on to the next house, and I stood there a while before I went back inside. None of it undoes the 13 days between the wire transfer and the sentence I said to a woman recovering from surgery in my own house. I don't think anything undoes that. I think you carry some debts instead of paying them off, and the carrying is the whole of what's left to do. I still work in wealth management. I've thought, more than once, about leaving the field entirely, about how strange it is to spend my days advising other people on trust and stewardship when I know exactly what I did with both. Once, when it was inconvenient to be trustworthy. I haven't left. I've stayed, instead, and tried to be the kind of advisor now who asks the extra question, who double-checks the flag instead of clearing it, remembers that every account on my screen belongs to someone's Eleanor. It isn't a grand redemption. Most days, it's just a slightly more careful version of an ordinary job. I've decided that has to be enough, because it's what's actually available to me. And because Eleanor, I think, would have found the grander version of this story a little embarrassing anyway. If there's a moral in this, and I've thought about it enough to trust the one I landed on, it's this: the people we're quickest to call a burden are sometimes the ones quietly holding the weight we haven't admitted is ours. Watch what someone does with their hands, not just what they let you say to their face. Eleanor Ellison agreed with me the day I called her a burden, and for 8 years I mistook her agreement for the absence of a fight. It was never that. It was a woman who had already decided, in silence, exactly what she was willing to carry, and had simply chosen not to make me watch her carry it. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.